Imagine that everything you have ever heard about Jesus is only the surface of a much deeper mystery. Imagine that behind the familiar stories, behind the symbols repeated for centuries, there exists a hidden body of wisdom carefully protected by ancient orders, mystics and Hermetic philosophers. Think for a moment that Jesus was not merely a figure of faith, but a living key to understanding the architecture of the universe, the structure of the soul, and the true nature of reality. What if I told you that as we move through this journey together, we will uncover layers of meaning that were intentionally concealed, and that the final revelation, the one awaiting at the end, is the most powerful of all, capable of altering the way you perceive existence itself? The mystic Jesus, truth behind the veil, is not just a topic, it is an invitation. It calls those who feel the subtle pull toward hidden knowledge, those who sense that the world is more mysterious than it appears. Throughout centuries, spiritual seekers, Hermetic scholars, and esoteric thinkers have argued that Jesus embodied a level of consciousness far beyond conventional understanding. Not a religious icon frozen in history, but an awakened being whose teachings encode universal laws found in ancient Egyptian wisdom, early Gnostic manuscripts, and the Hermetic principles attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. Authors such as Rudolf Steiner and Manly Palmerhall dedicated decades of research to unraveling these mysteries, revealing that the life of Jesus is also a map for the inner evolution of every human being. Before we continue, take a moment to support this journey. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, comment your thoughts, and share this video with someone who is ready to dive deeper into the unseen dimensions of spiritual truth. Throughout this exploration, surprising revelations will surface, and some of them may challenge everything you believed about divinity, consciousness, and the path of awakening. The final insight is the most transformative, and I guarantee it will illuminate layers of meaning that many never imagine exist. Now think about this. If Jesus spoke in parables, was it only for simplicity or to encode knowledge meant to be understood only by those prepared to perceive its depth? According to scholars like Elaine Pagels, the early Gnostics believed that Jesus offered two levels of teaching. For the masses, he used stories the common mind could grasp. But for the inner circle, he transmitted knowledge of the soul's origin, the multidimensional nature of the human spirit, and the steps to achieving union with the divine. These teachings were not about religion, but about consciousness. They were about rediscovering the divine spark buried within every human being. Consider the phrase, "the kingdom of heaven is within you." Many interpret it as poetic metaphor, but mystics throughout history insist it is a literal instruction. The inner kingdom represents a higher state of awareness, an elevated perception that awakens when the mind becomes aligned with universal principles. Hermetic texts describe this as the realization that the human soul mirrors the cosmos. As above, so below. As within, so without. Jesus did not preach an external kingdom. He pointed toward the inner alchemy, capable of transforming fear into clarity, doubt into wisdom, and limitation into expansion. Look at the symbolism of light in his teachings. Light in esoteric traditions represents consciousness. When Jesus says, "Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life," thinkers like Henry Corbin interpret this not as blind devotion, but as a call to embody a higher state of being. Light is awareness. Light is truth perceived without distortion. Light is the awakening of the inner Christ, a term used by mystics to describe the divine essence within every human soul waiting to be activated. Throughout history, groups such as the Essenes, the Gnostics, and various Hermetic schools preserved these deeper interpretations, often hidden from mainstream society. Many of them saw Jesus not as an unreachable figure, but as the prototype of what humanity can become when aligned with universal laws. They believed his miracles were demonstrations of spiritual principles available to anyone who understands them. In this view, the resurrection symbolizes the triumph of consciousness over the illusions of the material world, a symbol of awakening from spiritual sleep. Have you ever felt, for even a brief moment, the sense that you are more than your thoughts, more than your fears, more than your physical identity? That fleeting awareness, as described by mystics from Plotinus to Jacob Boehmer, is the same inner presence Jesus manifested fully. Let yourself reflect on this. If Jesus revealed the path to a higher state of existence through his teachings, what does that mean for your own potential? What limitations have you accepted that no longer belong to you? What truth is waiting to emerge within your own inner world? As we move forward, we will delve deeper into the hidden symbols behind his teachings, the esoteric parallels between his message and ancient traditions, and the profound implications they hold for your spiritual journey. And remember, the final revelation in this exploration is the most important of all, the one that connects every thread and unveils the true essence of the mystic Jesus, an essence that may fundamentally transform the way you understand yourself and the universe. To continue unveiling the deeper layers of the mystic Jesus, we must journey further into the symbolic landscape that surrounds his teachings. Think for a moment about the symbols that appear again and again: the dove, the serpent, the mountain, the desert, the hidden chamber, the light that emerges in moments of revelation. None of these elements are accidental. Scholars like Carl Gustav Jung argued that such symbols form part of the collective unconscious, patterns that reflect universal stages of spiritual development. When Jesus uses them, he is not merely speaking to the people of his time. He is speaking to every soul across every generation who feels the call toward inner awakening. Now imagine the desert where Jesus spent 40 days, not as a physical place, but as an inner state. In mystical traditions, the desert represents the stripping away of illusions, the emptying of the mind to reveal what lies underneath. The Essenes, who were known for their discipline and spiritual practices, believed purification was necessary before receiving higher knowledge. Early Hermetic teachings echo this idea, describing the desert as the stage where the initiate confronts the shadow, transforms it, and emerges with clearer perception. This suggests that Jesus was demonstrating a universal path, the inner journey through solitude, silence, and introspection, where the ego dissolves and the higher self begins to speak. Think about the miracles attributed to Jesus. What if they were not mere acts of supernatural power, but demonstrations of spiritual principles misunderstood by the unprepared? When he turned water into wine, some mystical commentators interpret that as the transformation of the ordinary soul into a higher state of being. Water symbolizes emotion, the raw human condition. Wine symbolizes spirit, the elevated and refined essence. Seen through this lens, the miracle is not about altering physical matter, but revealing the hidden capacity within the human soul to transform itself through divine awareness. When he calmed the storm, esoteric scholars like Dion Fortune suggest this symbolizes mastery over the turbulent forces of the mind. The sea represents the unconscious, and the storm represents the chaos of unexamined thoughts and emotions. Jesus quieting the waters becomes a symbolic teaching. Inner peace is possible when one aligns with higher consciousness. This interpretation does not deny the literal possibility of miracles. It adds a deeper dimension, one that speaks directly to your spiritual journey. How many storms have you faced within yourself? How many times have your thoughts raged like waves crashing against the shore? What if the message hidden in the story is that you hold the same ability to find calm, to command the internal chaos into stillness? Another powerful symbol emerges in the moment Jesus withdraws to the mountains. Mountains in esoteric traditions represent ascension, the journey toward higher awareness. They appear in the stories of Moses, Elijah, Gautama Buddha, and many other enlightened figures. When Jesus climbs the mountain, it symbolizes the elevation of consciousness above worldly distractions. Mystics interpret these moments as teachings that spiritual clarity requires rising above daily noise to connect with higher frequencies of thought. Have you ever noticed that your greatest insights often come in moments of solitude, silence, or stillness? This is the same principle at work, a natural law that spiritual masters across ages have emphasized. Now consider the most profound statement Jesus ever made: "I and the Father are one." Many interpret this as a declaration of divinity, but esoteric traditions propose a more expansive meaning. According to thinkers like Meister Eckhart, this statement reflects the union between the individual soul and the divine source. It is the realization that the inner essence of every human being is connected to the eternal. Jesus is not elevating himself above humanity. He is revealing the destiny of humanity, the awakening of divine consciousness within the self. This realization forms the foundation of mystical Christianity, Hermetic philosophy, and many ancient spiritual traditions. Throughout history, hidden communities preserved this perspective. The Gnostics believed Jesus came to remind humanity of its forgotten origin, the divine spark imprisoned in the material world. They taught that salvation is not escape, but awakening. Meanwhile, early Hermeticists emphasized that Jesus exemplified the principle of the macrocosm reflected in the microcosm, the universe mirrored within the human soul. Scholars like Jean-Yves Leloup argue that these interpretations offer a radically different view of spiritual development, one where Jesus becomes not a distant idol, but a mirror reflecting our highest potential. Reflect on this for a moment. What does it mean for you personally if the figure of Jesus represents the path to inner transformation? How does this reshape the way you see your challenges, your purpose, or your sense of identity? Could it be that the teachings you once saw as external instructions are actually internal keys waiting to be used? As we continue, we will unravel even more profound connections between Jesus and ancient mystical traditions, exploring how the wisdom of Egypt, Greece, and the early Middle East converges around the same spiritual core. Step by step, we move closer to the final revelation, the one that ties every symbol, every insight, and every hidden truth into a single transformative understanding. To continue uncovering the hidden dimensions of the mystic Jesus, we must turn our attention to the ancient world that shaped the foundations of spiritual knowledge. Imagine walking through the temples of Egypt, the philosophical schools of Greece, and the desert sanctuaries of the Middle East, where sages, mystics, and initiates sought answers to the deepest questions of existence. These places were not merely centers of culture. They were laboratories of consciousness, where spiritual science was studied with the same seriousness that physical science is studied today. According to researchers like Gerald Massey, the wisdom teachings that circulated long before the time of Jesus laid the groundwork for a universal language of symbols and spiritual principles that would later reappear in his message. This suggests that Jesus did not exist in isolation. He stood at the convergence of ancient streams of esoteric knowledge. Think about the striking parallels between Jesus and the ancient mysteries. In Egyptian symbolism, the divine child represents the awakening of inner divinity within the human soul. This theme repeats in the stories of Horus, Osiris, and Isis, where the resurrection of Osiris symbolizes the victory of spirit over matter. Many scholars note that the idea of rebirth was not a literal event, but a metaphor for spiritual transformation. When Jesus speaks of being born again, mystics argue he is referring to the same awakening described in Egyptian teachings, the rebirth of consciousness, the moment the inner light is remembered. If this is true, then Jesus is not introducing a new concept, but revealing the universal path of inner resurrection. Now imagine entering the philosophical schools of ancient Greece, where thinkers like Plato explored the relationship between the soul and the divine. Plato described the human soul as a spark of the eternal, temporarily embodied in physical form. He taught that true knowledge comes from remembering the divine origin concealed beneath layers of illusion. When Jesus teaches that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, some scholars see this as a continuation of the Platonic idea that divinity is not distant, but intimately present within the human being. The sacred is not above us, it is within us, waiting to be unveiled. Consider also the influence of the early Middle Eastern traditions. The Essenes, known for their disciplined spiritual practices, believed in purification of thought, control of breath, and deep meditation as pathways to divine connection. Many researchers argue that Jesus may have been familiar with their teachings, as his message of inner purity and spiritual clarity echoes their principles. The Essenes taught that spiritual evolution requires the harmonization of mind, body, and spirit. When Jesus heals the sick, some mystics interpret this as symbolic of healing the fragmentation within the soul, restoring harmony where disorder once existed. Now let us explore a concept central to Hermeticism, the idea that the universe and the human soul reflect one another. As above, so below is more than a philosophical phrase. It is a profound statement about the nature of existence. When Jesus performs acts of creation, transformation, or manifestation, Hermetic scholars suggest he is demonstrating the truth that the human mind, when aligned with divine law, has creative power. The miracles become symbolic representations of the inner potential every human being possesses. If this interpretation is correct, then the teachings of Jesus are not meant to be admired from a distance, They are meant to be lived from within. Reflect for a moment on the symbolism of the cross, one of the most profound symbols in spiritual history. Many believe the cross represents suffering, but esoteric traditions propose a deeper meaning. The vertical line symbolizes the divine realm, while the horizontal line symbolizes the human realm. Their intersection represents the union of divine consciousness with the human experience. According to mystical commentators like Jacob Boehme, the cross symbolizes the moment the soul awakens to its true nature, rising above fear, illusion, and limitation. In this sense, the crucifixion becomes a symbol of the death of ignorance, and the resurrection becomes a symbol of the birth of spiritual wisdom. Think about how this interpretation changes the narrative. Instead of focusing on suffering, it highlights transformation. Instead of emphasizing sacrifice, it emphasizes awakening. Instead of portraying Jesus as distant, it reveals him as a guide who walks the same inner path that every seeker must eventually walk. What does this mean for your own life? How many moments have felt like a personal crucifixion, where old beliefs or identities had to die so a new understanding could be born? How many times have you experienced your own small resurrections, moments where clarity broke through confusion or strength emerged from vulnerability? As we continue this journey, notice how each symbol, each teaching, and each ancient tradition aligns around the same central truth, the awakening of the divine essence within the human soul. Jesus becomes the bridge, the living demonstration of what it means to embody this truth fully. And yet, the most profound revelation remains ahead, the one that unites all these elements into a single, illuminating insight. It is the revelation that not only defines the mystic Jesus, but illuminates the path of every soul seeking awakening. Before moving forward, reflect deeply. What hidden potential lies within you waiting for recognition? What inner light is preparing to emerge? What truth is aligning itself within your consciousness, ready to be revealed? The answer to these questions will become clearer as we enter the final movement of this exploration, where the veil lifts completely and the deepest meaning of the mystic Jesus is brought to light. As we enter the final stage of this journey into the gospel, they tried to hide. Imagine the last veil slowly being lifted. Up until now, we have explored fragments, echoes, and whispered remnants of a wisdom that was overshadowed by time and authority. But now, as we step into this final revelation, everything begins to converge. The ancient teachings, the suppressed traditions, the mystical philosophies, and the timeless call for humanity to awaken. This is the moment where the deeper meaning emerges, where the truth hidden beneath centuries finally reveals its purpose. Think once more of the early centuries after the life of Jesus. Scholars such as Elaine Pagels, Hans Jonas, and Karen King describe this era not as a period of uniform beliefs, but as a vibrant landscape of spiritual exploration. Different groups interpreted his message in profoundly different ways. Many of these groups believed that the teachings of Jesus were far more mystical than dogmatic, far more introspective than ritualistic. They believed he came not merely to deliver commandments, but to awaken consciousness. And this awakening, they asserted, was the key to understanding one's true essence. This is why texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and the Secret Book of John were so revolutionary. These writings did not present salvation as something granted by external powers. Instead, they proclaimed that salvation arises from self-knowledge. According to these teachings, the human being is not a passive recipient of divine favor, but an active participant in the unfolding of spiritual truth. The divine spark within the individual is the seed of transformation. When nurtured through contemplation, awareness, and inner inquiry, it blossoms into a profound realization. The divine is not distant, it is present within. Now pause and imagine how this message would have resonated with the earliest seekers. Imagine a fisherman, a shepherd, a craftsman, or a mother in the first century, hearing that the kingdom of heaven is not far away, but already within them. Imagine the empowerment that such a message would bring, the sense of inner dignity, the awakening of purpose. This is precisely why these teachings were embraced by early mystical communities, and why they became a threat to institutions seeking to define and control spiritual authority. As we continue, reflect on this deeply. Throughout human history, whenever a teaching emerges that reveals the inner power of the individual, it is met with resistance. Hermetic philosophy was hidden in secret manuscripts, Kabbalistic wisdom was concealed behind symbolic language. The teachings of the Essenes were preserved in remote deserts. The insights of Eastern mystics were transmitted from master to disciple in private. This pattern reveals an undeniable truth. Humanity has always possessed access to deeper knowledge, but only a few have been willing to seek it. Now we arrive at the most profound revelation of this journey. The gospel they tried to hide is not merely a book, a text, or an artifact. It is a message that speaks to the core of human existence. You carry the divine within you. You are not separate from the source. You are an expression of it. When Jesus spoke of the kingdom, he was not pointing to a distant paradise, but to a state of awakened consciousness available here and now. This truth, echoed by mystics across cultures, holds the key to understanding your purpose and your destiny. But why was this truth hidden? Why were these teachings overshadowed by structures of authority? To understand this, we must recognize the immense power contained in self-knowledge. When individuals realize that spiritual authority resides within, they no longer fear external control. They become guided by inner clarity rather than external pressure. They become seekers rather than followers. And this independence threatens systems built on hierarchy and obedience. Yet the truth survived. Not because institutions allowed it, but because seekers across centuries protected it. It survived in caves, monasteries, desert libraries, and secret teachings. It survived because the human soul, when awakened, becomes a guardian of truth. And now, in an age where information flows freely and humanity yearns for spiritual depth, the hidden gospel resurfaces with renewed force. Consider what this means for you. If the divine spark truly lives within you, then you possess the power to transform your life from the inside out. Your fears no longer have dominion over you. Your doubts become stepping stones. Your suffering becomes a catalyst for awakening. When you understand that your consciousness is connected to the very fabric of the universe, you begin to see life differently. You begin to realize that every challenge is an invitation, every setback a lesson, every moment an opportunity to remember who you truly are. Now reflect on this. What would change in your life if you embraced this truth fully? How would your relationships shift if you saw the divine spark in others? How would your goals change if you recognized your own inner strength? And most importantly, how would your spiritual journey transform if you believed without hesitation that the kingdom of heaven is already within you? Share your reflections in the comments, because your insights can inspire others who walk this path. The final revelation of this journey is simple yet transformative. The gospel they tried to hide is not lost. It lives in every seeker who chooses to look within. It lives in every moment of silence, every act of compassion, every step taken towards self-knowledge. It lives in you. When you awaken to this truth, you realize that nothing external can imprison your spirit. You realize that enlightenment is not a distant ideal, but a living reality, accessible through inner awareness. As we conclude this journey, remember that the path of awakening is not about escaping the world, but seeing it through new eyes. The same teachings that were once hidden are now revealing themselves to those who are ready to understand. And if you have listened this far, if you have walked through these ancient corridors with an open mind and an open heart, then you are already responding to the call of the hidden gospel. Carry this truth with you. Let it guide your thoughts, your choices, and your actions. Let it remind you that you are part of a vast, interconnected universe, and that the divine spark within you is both ancient and eternal. The gospel they tried to hide was never meant to be silenced forever. It was meant to be rediscovered by those who are ready to awaken, seekers like you. Thanks for looking.